Singapore, the success story. It's been 50 years since the island city-state was forced to become independent. Well, after starting with so little, how did Singapore become one of the world's leading economies? And can that model be replicated? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. Well, Singapore was once a tiny, impoverished nation without resources. Today, it's a high-tech powerhouse and the envy of its neighbours. It was occupied, though, first by the British and then the Japanese. In 1965, it became independent, but not by choice. It was kicked out of Malaysia in 1965 against the backdrop of racial tension. Well, now, 50 years later, Singaporeans are lining the streets to celebrate the anniversary. With a population of just over 5 million, Singapore has defied the odds to become one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And as Jazeera Rahman reports, it's become a model for other powers who strive for the same success.
He's lived through all of Singapore's modern history. Born in 1934, Bill To owns this comic book store in a small part of the city.
Issue 1.
In his day, he was at the forefront of a changing Singapore. As an assistant superintendent of the police force, he was part of a team that saw colonial rulers leave and then fought communist ideology during the Cold War.
As a security officer, I had no doubt where we would get to where we are today, because I knew our former Prime Minister was capable of taking us to where we are.
That former Prime Minister was Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's founding father, who retired from office and died earlier this year, but not before transforming the island nation from a small colonial beginning to one with a growing economy, flourishing tourism industry and a centre for international commerce. New shiny skyscrapers sit side by side with their predecessors. There is room for both in a country that is proud of its age, its history and achievements. Young and old are visiting museums and galleries and enjoying the shows on offer. The weather is not putting off the thousands who've decided to share the 50th anniversary of Singapore's independence.
It is looking to fulfill.
For some, like historian Jaya Ayadurani, remembering the past is a humbling experience.
The younger generation lives in the first world state. They don't understand what we went through. We didn't have electricity, we didn't have safety. I came home one day being told at 8 years old that we were linked to the national grid, and it was electricity. And that's the kind of life we went through.
For many, the past cannot be forgotten. The death of Lee earlier this year and what he achieved during his tenure has led to speculation that a general election may be called in the coming months. An election that would determine the future direction that this island nation moves towards. Back at Bill's shop, he's proud of the medals he's earned for long service and dedication. He's one of many here who are eager to make sure history doesn't forget the sacrifices of so many during the Second World War and independence. So for now, they're happy to join the party. Jazeera Rahman, Al Jazeera, Singapore.
So what is Singapore's secret to its success, and can other countries adopt the same model? Let's bring in our guests to discuss this. They're both actually in Singapore. We have Song Sang-woon, an independent economist, and Elliot Brennan, a non-resident research fellow with the Institute for Security and Development Policy. Good to have you both with us. Let's start with Song. Many developing countries, of course, face challenges, but few have accomplished what Singapore has. What do you think has been the secret to that success?
Well, I suppose the most important after it was forced to leave Malaysia really was to essentially concentrate, finding jobs for the people that certainly were thrown out, put a roof over their head, ensure that there's law and order in the economy itself, and very quickly just try to have a government which is as clean as possible to push to plans essentially to build up Singapore itself. So it's just basically survival, forcing the government to do simple things which we learn in Econ 101 well.
it's interesting, but you've pointed out there, Song, some of the things which, of course, Singapore has provided for its citizens, housing, jobs, and so on. But Elliot, we've seen other developing countries face those kinds of challenges, try and work on providing those kinds of services for its citizens, but not reaching the level Singapore has. Some point to, you know, the different secret ingredient being the vision of one man, Lee Kuan Yew, the pragmatism before ideology, or the hard-working culture. Is it all of that or any of that, Elliot?
Certainly, Lee Kuan Yew played a huge part in the development of Singapore. Singapore grew from a place of great insecurity around the region, with communist insurgents across the region trying to overthrow governments. Lee Kuan Yew managed to stabilize the small, or the impossible nation, shall we say, that was the small island state, and push it into the push it into the future with big ideas, brave and bold ideas that we didn't see anywhere else at that point, really.
Song, is it sometimes overstated? There's no doubt, you know, Lee Kuan Yew's legacy is not doubted by many, and his contribution to where Singapore stands today. But were there others? Was it more of a team? People like Dr. Goh Keng Swee, Mr. Rajanatram. I mean,
Indeed.
They don't always get so much attention, do they?
Indeed, much less so. I think what also happened at the back was there is really also a team or advisor just essentially telling him, okay, you are now on your own. What do you need to do in terms of making sure that the economy can hum and run itself? So it's really those advisors behind them that put forward the plan that Lee Kuan Yew and, I suppose, his team listen to and execute. I think this is a huge difference that perhaps makes the difference here. Indeed, we know what needs to be done. It has to be executed and then basically carried through. And this is where, I suppose, of the strong will of that team, including obviously the late Mr. Lee, that essentially allows the economy to gel together than fall apart, because certainly this is a multiracial country itself. So if it had allowed racial tension to boil over, that certainly would have created a very different Singapore today.
You put your finger on a very sensitive point there, which I want to pick up more on, Song. But since we're talking about what difference that team and its strong will made, let's review some of the facts, shall we? Well, Singapore improved the living standards of its people faster and more comprehensively than many other nations. For example, when Singapore was expelled from Malaysia in 1965, its per capita income was just $500. That was the same as Ghana's. Well, Singapore's per capita income today is shot up to $55,000, the largest increase any newly independent nation has enjoyed. Singapore's infant mortality has also decreased faster than any other society, for example, going down from 35 per 1,000 live births in 1965 to just 10.9 in 1985. Education, that's world-class too, at least if you believe the OECD. It ranked 15-year-old Singaporean children #1 in the world in a recent global ranking of universal basic skills in mathematics and science. And in contrast to the slums Singaporeans may remember, today Singapore has the highest home ownership of any country in the world at 90%. Elliot, those are some impressive numbers, aren't they, Elliot? But could that sort of progress have been made without a degree of authoritarianism?
Well, they are impressive figures indeed. And I think that Lee Kuan Yew's method of pushing for a meritocracy, empirically derived policy is very important towards getting to those figures of, you know, the dramatic increase we saw in wealth in across all the human development indexes. I think they have been driven by firm and well thought out policies. As Lee Kuan Yew would say, though, that there are certain measures that need to be taken to reach those developments. And there are sacrifices that have to be made to push through such rapid development. Of course, goes to the heart of of the question of Singapore and the state of Singapore today. Did they sacrifice too much along the way? Do they need to change? Do they need to be moved from a liberal democracy to a liberal democracy? And those are the questions that I think Singapore is searching for today and searching for the answers today.
From an economic perspective, Song, I mean, that system, that, shall we call it, strictness, leaving not too much room for dissent, it was vital, was it not, in building the economy? Things like forced savings helped actually channel money back into investment in the country, and right?
Yeah, indeed. I think that was 50 years ago when all those tough decisions has to be made with a very firm hand, essentially to make sure that the ship, points in the direction and everybody's rowing at the same pace, etc. as well. Now we've got to a stage where the infrastructure is there, is essentially maintaining it. Housing, as you pointed out, isn't an issue here. I think for Singaporean itself, it's not really about food on the table or a job. It's probably the more expensive cars that they're wondering if they can afford to or not. So that's basically what perhaps the future Singaporean would be looking at. They have achieved so much over the last 50 years very quickly itself. Now, can that kind of fairly firm hand that has guided Singapore to where it is today, can it be relaxed? How much can it be relaxed? I think Elliot, pointed out this before. So
I'm
this
keen,
is where
Song, forgive me for interrupting.
Itself.
This is what precisely I'm keen to know. Your perspective, especially as an economist as well, how do you see the future model? Can what has worked in the past work in the future?
No, not with a kind of firm hand. I think this is where, again, the current generation of leaders, politicians themselves, is also a lot more pragmatic now. They've done all the hard work. Infrastructure is in place. Hard work in terms of I suppose, the economy having reached here. Now it's the software, it's the people now. Can Singapore grow its population as fast as it did over, say, the last 3 decades, where it was 1 million every decade or so? I think that is coming back, where Singaporeans said, look, it's grown too fast, too quickly, we wanted to slow down, but obviously slow population growth has implications for the economy and economic growth as well. So this is the balance where they would have to listen to what Singaporeans now aspire to. Does it want to continue to push for 4 or 5% growth, or are they comfortable now with a slower pace of growth? So I think this is where we are seeing the reality sinking in, where the political and politicians themselves are saying, okay, we hear you, we may have to sort of tweak things along the way a little bit, because we have reached so much. We have got so much in so short a period of time that we are now going to fine-tune the software side, because the hardware is already in place.
Very interesting, because Elliot, it sounds to me like what we're talking about now is really a change in the model of governance. Before it was top-down, now we're talking about something different. The government has to listen to people. What does the middle class want today then?
Well, these are trends that we're seeing the world over. As with the rise of social media, we're seeing a diffusion of power away from government into the hands of the many. And we've seen that the world over, the Arab Spring or some of the movements in the US, for example. And that Singapore is part of this global movement. And there's big pressures being put on the government.
Well, hang on, is that a good thing or a bad thing from a security perspective? I mean, I'm glad you referenced the Arab Spring there. In some countries that seems to be kind of ticking along, like Tunisia. In other countries, the sort of bottom-up approach doesn't seem to have really worked out yet. What is your security take for how it might play out in Singapore?
Well, instability is never desirable for governments, for the economy, for the wider political landscape. So what we need to find a solution is merging both this growth in social movements and having governments being more responsive. And I think that boils down to the heart of where the change that Singapore must go through now. And that's really the soul searching that I think is going on at the moment, ushering in a new crop of a new generation of leadership through. Sorry, go ahead.
Finish the thought then, Song.
Yeah, sorry. I'm following on Elliot's point. You see, I think this is where again is while it may tolerate a little bit more of so-called, I suppose, dissent among the population side, the control over such issue as race, religion, I suppose, remains very important. I mean, we're talking about the uprising, be it in the Middle East, etc. I think within Singapore, I think the authorities themselves realize that there's a fine balance that they have to maintain among the races, the Indian, the Chinese, etc. as well. And so on that front, they're very firm. There is going to be no issue that would going to cause any racial tension on that side itself. But nonetheless, among other issues, there will be a little bit more flexibility, shall we say, itself. So this is where, again, for its economic success, the law and order coming from anything related to race and religion cannot be, I suppose, negotiated.
Elliot, could that lead to an unraveling once the government starts to relax its control?
Well, traditionally, I mean, Singapore has done very well at having racial, ethnic harmony. The best example, and one that I think can be employed as part of this Singapore model that is so popular, is public housing, having quotas of the different ethnic groups within the country within the same public housing. And that was really the push that created Singapore, was partly driven by a move away from the ethnocentric state building that we saw in Malaysia in the 60s, and Lee Kuan Yew wanted to get away from this. So I think this is in the makeup, in the blood, in the DNA of Singapore. It has traditionally done very well on this front. The pressures that we're seeing now is that over the last decade there have been a new immigration policy that has been pushed in, trying to add that extra million people to the population, the Singaporean population here, and that has been wildly unpopular, and we are seeing some backlash towards that. In 2013, there were small protests over the introduction of that over the immigration policy, over a white paper that was drawn up, and this is something which, in the lead up to possible elections, and I would expect they ride on the SG50 celebrations that we're seeing here this weekend, which are dragging up a lot of patriotism, a lot of nostalgia for the past and the former PAP. I think that will be something that we're seeing. The immigration policy will be an important one for the coming elections, and ultimately that's why we're seeing it being scaled back in recent months of late.
Indeed.
In preparations for elections.
Song, Elliot's mentioned here immigration and population change, and is that perhaps the key thing that is changing, not just because of immigration, but the people have changed? This generation of Singaporeans are not worried about the fragility of the country, the vulnerability of the state. They take for granted that they have a strong and economically successful state. They're more worried about maybe freedom of the press, the space for the opposition, income inequality. Priorities are changing.
Other issues, because they don't have to worry. Yeah, exactly. They don't have to worry about jobs because it's relatively easy for them to find work here. Again, housing isn't a big problem. It was up to some point, but it's never really enough of a problem that will cause them to rise. So in that sense, so it's really simple issues to the rest of the world, really, how crowded the bus is, the train is, how jammed the traffic on the road is, which is why, for the government, rather than, allowing 1 million people every 10 years, which had been great from a standpoint of economic growth, they really are scaling them back. Rather than 1 million every decade now, perhaps it would be 1 million every, 15, 17 years itself. So that itself would have implication on this economy, especially when it is aging at the same time as well. So it isn't a rush in that sense to try to therefore ensure that the older Singapore, so Singaporean going forward, still have a higher level of standard of living because they have the productive capacity to cope with the slower growth, etc. as well.
Interesting, Song. So Elliot, the couple of points which I'm drawing from this discussion, we said earlier the model is kind of changing from the very strict sort of top down. The population is changing too. Is there then still a Singapore model that's relevant for other countries today then?
Well, a model should always be picked over. There's certain aspects of Singapore's development which have been exceptional and should be looked to, as the public housing that I mentioned earlier. There are elements of that which have greatly improved the stability of and the development, economic development of Singapore as a whole over the last 5 decades.
And that's something that other countries can still
model,
learn from today?
Certainly. More and more, I think we need to find mechanisms of interfaith dialogue, of religious harmony, of ethnic harmony across Southeast Asia and across the wider world. And Singapore has had some success in building that model. How it faces the challenge of greater immigration to Singapore will be really test its legacy on that one.
Song, I could see you wanted to get in there, so...
Yeah. If I can add on to that, I think what's also unique in Singapore is because of the longevity of this government itself, it has been able to plan very, very far ahead. Not many government has that luxury or in that position itself, and as a result of which it can execute, fine-tune any such policies as they so wish at any point in time as well. Now, going forward, is that going still to be the assumption one can make about Singapore, that it can then plan 10-year, 20-year, 30-year, and along the way execute itself? That's something I'm not quite sure of, but I think even now the government and politicians are also getting ready for the day that perhaps you may get opposition coming in who may have other idea of how to run a government, etc. as well. So for Singapore, I think what's also unique, apart from just executing and going through with policies which are essentially just Econ 101 policy, but the capacity to carry them through because it lived long enough to be able to see them through.
That's an interesting point. There have been other countries, though, Song, that shall we say, have leaned towards authoritarian rule, even dictatorship, but haven't achieved the sort of results which have been achieved in Singapore.
Well, I suppose the difference really is clean government at the end of the day. You're talking about government which is very transparent. What it collects, it's spent. What it doesn't spend, it invests in, and it shows the account to everybody itself. So that transparent, clean government, which is very effective in therefore implementing policy, is also, I suppose, the cornerstone of the policy here.
Interesting. Elliot, I mentioned some figures at the beginning. You know, Ghana had the same sort of level of per capita income as Singapore back in 1965. They were both at $500. Well, today, Ghana is aiming for $4,800. That's a big difference from where Singapore is at $50,000 or $55,000. I mean, looking forward, if the middle class is pushing for more democracy, if that means less, shall we say, stability or ability to long-term plan, is that going to jeopardize Singapore's economic future?
Well, I think there's a lot of factors that play into this. The future of Singapore is ultimately we're going forward without the trusted leadership of Lee Kuan Yew. He managed to have that iron fist and pull some of pull off some of the more difficult policies in Singapore because he was trusted. Because he had the faith, the goodwill of the people, and people believed in him, his ability to pull them through. I think going forward with a new leadership, there will be more challenges for Singapore. We have a whole bunch of different problems that have to be tackled. Declining fertility rates. Singapore's place as a developed country within a developing region will see many issues and many problems arise in Singapore.
Still
migration issues that we've seen the world
to be
over.
Sorted out on the agenda.
They could be waiting round the corner for Singapore.
All right, we're going to have to thank our guests and leave it there for now. Thanks so much, Song there and Elliot, both in Singapore. And thank you for watching. As always, we're keen to hear your thoughts. Just get in touch via our programme page on aljazeera.com, or you can post your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you can tweet us using @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zaidan, and the whole team, it's goodbye for now.